Leaving begins quietly. It begins the exact moment hope becomes more exhausting than disappointment. The morning light over Lake Michigan was the color of bruised iron, filtering through the panoramic windows of the sprawling Chicago estate. Inside, the air felt perfectly climate-controlled, yet entirely devoid of warmth. Leonardo Moretti stood near the threshold of the master bedroom, his heavy leather shoes making no sound against the imported wool rug. A phone was pressed tightly to his ear. He was speaking in low, measured tones about shipping logistics and syndicate boundaries. His mind was entirely occupied by the complex architecture of his empire. A few feet away, Ava Vance was packing. She did not slam the heavy mahogany closet doors. She did not throw garments into the modest leather suitcase resting on the mattress. Her movements were precise, quiet, and completely deliberate. The dignified woman folded a simple gray wool sweater, smoothing the sleeves down with a steady hand. Leonardo glanced at her briefly. He assumed she was merely preparing for a standard 2-week visit to her older sister, Beatrice, in Chicago. He did not look closely enough to notice that she was bypassing the silk dresses and designer heels he had purchased for her. Instead, his wife tucked her oldest, most comfortable shoes into the corner of the bag. Handle the Port Authority by Tuesday. The syndicate leader instructed the captain on the line. He lowered the phone, stepping forward to mindfully adjust the collar of Ava's wool coat. It was an automatic reflex. He did not look into her eyes to see if they were tired. He simply smoothed the fabric, satisfied that she looked presentable before stepping out. As the suitcase was zipped closed, the man's gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the massive ensuite bathroom. There, resting exactly in the center of the cold marble vanity, sat the platinum band. The heavy diamond-encrusted wedding ring caught the bleak morning light. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his mind. A woman married to a man of his status did not leave her wedding ring behind. Yet, he rationalized the visual anomaly immediately. She must have taken it off to apply hand cream and simply forgotten it in her haste. After all, it was just a temporary trip. There was no need to assign heavy emotional meaning to a misplaced piece of jewelry. "You forgot your ring on the counter," he pointed out casually. "I know," she replied. She did not turn back to retrieve it. She picked up her luggage. Leonardo nodded, kissed her cheek, a dry, perfunctory touch, and watched her walk down the sweeping staircase. He assumed the marriage was fine. He did not know the foundation had just collapsed. With the town car gone, the house settled into an immense, echoing quiet. For the mafia boss, the silence was not a warning, it was a luxury. Without his wife quietly moving through the halls, he felt a surge of absolute freedom. He immediately began using the sprawling mansion to host high-stakes syndicate meetings late into the night. The massive formal dining room, usually kept immaculate, was now clouded with the thick, acrid smoke of expensive cigars and the sharp scent of spilled scotch. Heavy-shouldered men argued over territories and enforcement tactics, while Leonardo sat at the head of the table, entirely relaxed. He did not have to worry about lowering his voice. He did not have to worry about disturbing her rest. Occasionally, his gaze would drift to the empty chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. For years, Ava had occupied that space, offering silent administrative grace to his chaotic life. She had ensured the catering was handled, the staff was dismissed on time, and the household operated with invisible efficiency. Now, the chair sat empty, gathering dust in the dim light of the crystal chandelier. Instead of feeling her absence as a loss, he felt a brief, profound moment of pride. As the days turned into a full week, and then stretched quietly toward 3, his neglect solidified into routine. He did not call to ask how Beatrice was doing. He did not text to see if anything was needed. His mind remained consumed by ledgers, rivalries, and the mechanics of power. He assumed that because he provided a beautiful home and endless financial security, his physical presence was not required. In his mind, his wife was simply resting across town, waiting patiently for his eventual call. But by the 21st day, the absolute silence of the lakefront estate began to change texture. It was no longer the productive, uninterrupted quiet that Leonardo Moretti had enjoyed during the initial days of his wife's departure. Instead, it had hardened into a hollow, echoing stillness that seemed to follow him from room to room. He stood by the panoramic windows of his private study, a crystal glass of bourbon warming against his palm, and watched the gray fog roll off Lake Michigan. The house was immaculate, It was also entirely devoid of life. There was no soft ambient hum of a kettle boiling in the early morning. There was no scent of vanilla or cinnamon drifting down the marbled hallways. The heavy velvet curtains were no longer drawn back to let in the afternoon light. Leo adjusted the Heva silver cufflink at his wrist, a habitual gesture of seeking control. It had been 3 full weeks of high-stakes syndicate negotiations and midnight meetings. In all that time, he had not received a single phone call from her. No brief text messages checking on his schedule, no polite inquiries about his dinner plans. He told himself that Ava Vance was simply giving him the space he required to govern his empire. She was a composed woman, sensible enough to know that his work demanded absolute focus. Yet, as he listened to the rain begin to pattern against the reinforced glass, a faint, unfamiliar pressure settled at the base of his neck. It was not panic. Men in his position did not panic. It was merely a subtle administrative itch, the nagging sensation of an overlooked obligation that needed to be checked off a list. He set his glass down on the mahogany desk. He did not dial Beatrice Vance's Chicago residence. He did not attempt to call his wife directly. Instead, the powerful man chose a transaction. Pulling his phone from his tailored pocket, Leo opened a private luxury concierge application. His thumb swiped past standard arrangements, his eyes barely registering the images until he found the most expensive option available, entirely unaware that this careless purchase would soon become the returned rose box. He tapped the screen to select it. The application prompted him for a personalized message. Leo did not hesitate, nor did he type a single word of his own. He simply clicked the default, pre-written greeting, approving the exorbitant charge to his premium card. He directed the delivery to his sister-in-law's house, treating his wife's extended absence like a minor logistical error that could be smoothed over with sufficient capital. The entire process took less than 45 seconds. Leo locked his phone and tossed it onto the desk. He leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long breath. He felt a brief, hollow surge of satisfaction. In his world, loyalty was purchased and silence was managed. He believed he had just successfully handled his domestic life with the exact same detached efficiency he used to rule the city. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside the downtown syndicate headquarters was sharp, fast, and unforgiving. Leo sat at the head of a massive slate conference table, listening to his lieutenants detail the week's financial acquisitions. The room was a fortress of glass and steel, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and cold air conditioning. Here, his authority was absolute. A junior associate hesitated at the frosted glass door before knocking gently. The interruption caused a sudden hush. The young man stepped inside, carrying a large, rectangular black package that looked entirely out of place in a room built on intimidation and cold cash. Placed it carefully at the edge of Leo's desk, murmuring a quick apology before stepping back. Leo waved his hand in a short, dismissive gesture. The lieutenants immediately stood, gathered their files, and filed out of the room, closing the heavy door behind them. Left alone in the soundproof office, Leo looked down at the object. It was the returned rose box. Across the elegant, matte black lid, a stark, bright yellow postal sticker screamed its message in bold, indifferent type: undeliverable. Return to sender. No such recipient at this address. The low hum of the city traffic 70 floors below seemed to evaporate. Leo stared at the yellow sticker. He did not move. He did not blink. The bright, ugly color of the adhesive label contrasted violently against the luxury packaging, a glaring flaw in a system that was supposed to be perfect. He reached out slowly, his large hands unusually steady, and untied the black satin ribbon. He lifted the heavy lid and set it aside. The returned rose box held dozens of premium white blooms, but their edges had already begun to decay. Deprived of water and suffocated in transit, the petals had turned a bruised, papery brown. The scent that drifted up from the cardboard was not the sweet fragrance of romance, but the stagnant, metallic smell of dying vegetation. Leo reached out and traced a finger over one of the brittle, curling petals. The dry friction made a tiny, rasping sound in the absolute silence of the office. The realization did not arrive with a sudden, violent outburst. It did not make him slam his fists against the desk. It arrived like ice water slipping quietly down his spine. Ava was not in Chicago. She had never arrived at Beatrice's house. For 24 days, he had comfortably assumed. His wife was sitting in her sister's living room, waiting patiently for his signal to return. He had imagined her life paused, suspended in amber, entirely dependent on his timeline. Instead, she had simply vanished. His absolute control, his vast network of informants, his immense wealth, none of it had detected the fact that his own wife had stepped completely off his map. He noticed a small, thick envelope nestled among the decaying flowers. He pulled out the generic card he had authorized 3 days prior. The printed words, "Thinking of you," mocked him with their sterile, mechanized emptiness. He had not been thinking of her at all. He had only been thinking of maintaining the invisible machinery of his home, without having to acknowledge the woman operating it. Leo crushed the card slowly in his fist. He looked out the floor-to-soiling windows at the sprawling city skyline, a kingdom he commanded with brutal precision. He could track a shipment across an ocean, but he had absolutely no idea where his wife was sleeping tonight. The glass walls of his office suddenly felt less like a fortress, and entirely like a cage. Leonardo Moretti stood in the center of the modest living room, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the faded floral rug. The space smelled of dried lavender and old paper, a jarring contrast to the sharp scent of cigar smoke and polished leather that usually surrounded him. He kept his hands in the pockets of his tailored wool coat, waiting for the trembling compliance he was accustomed to. It did not come. Beatrice Vance sat in a worn armchair near the window, methodically pouring a stream of hot water into a ceramic teapot. She did not rush. She did not look up when he cleared his throat. The older sister shared the same quiet architecture as Ava, the same straight posture, the same infuriating ability to make silence feel like a physical wall. "The delivery service returned my package," the man said. His voice was pitched low, carrying the quiet, dangerous cadence that usually made his syndicate captains hold their breath. Beatrice set the kettle down. She placed a silver spoon on a matching saucer. The porcelain clinked softly in the quiet room. "I do not care for roses, Leo. I didn't send them for you." He took a slow, measured step forward, the floorboards creaking under his heavy weight. "Where is she?" Most people flinched when he stepped into their personal space. Beatrice simply lifted her cup, blowing the faint steam away from the rim. She took a slow, deliberate sip. She possessed a terrifying composure, proving that her loyalty to her sister far outweighed any fear of his reputation or his power. "She isn't here," Beatrice said, her voice entirely flat. He narrowed his eyes, searching the narrow hallway for luggage, for a familiar coat, for any sign of his wife's presence. Her suitcase was packed for 2 weeks. "If she isn't staying with you, then where is she?" She never arrived. Beatrice lowered her cup, resting her hands in her lap. She looked directly into the dark eyes of the powerful boss, completely unbothered by the sudden tension tightening his jaw. "She did not come to Chicago to visit me." "Then where did she go?" "Away," the woman answered smoothly. "She left Chicago for good." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Anger was a familiar language to him. Betrayal was a concept he understood exactly how to punish. But this calm, surgical removal of a life he thought he owned left him entirely disoriented. He stared at the quiet woman drinking her tea, realizing for the first time that his absolute control possessed a massive, glaring blind spot. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the lakeside estate later that evening, blurring the city lights into a smear of cold silver. Inside the cavernous study, the silence felt heavier than usual. Frustrated by the impenetrable wall of his sister-in-law's calm, Leonardo realized he could not use his usual methods to find the truth. Sending his own armed men to search for a missing wife would broadcast his domestic failure across the entire syndicate. A boss who could not keep his own house in order could not be trusted to manage an empire. He needed a ghost. Douglas Miller sat across the mahogany desk, a completely unremarkable man wearing a damp trench coat. The private investigator specialized in shadows, leaving no footprints and asking no moral questions. He sat perfectly still, a small notepad resting on his knee, waiting for the powerful man to admit his failure. Leonardo poured a measure of scotch into a heavy crystal glass. The ice cracked sharply in the quiet room. He did not offer a drink to the investigator. Instead, he slid a single photograph across the polished wood. "Find her," the husband commanded, his voice tight. Douglas picked up the photograph. It was an old picture, the edges slightly worn. "When was the last time you spoke with Ava?" The question was strictly professional, yet it felt like an accusation. The boss swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the crystal glass. Nearly a month ago. The investigator made a small, silent notation on his pad. Does she have a secondary phone? Credit cards tied to a private account? A vehicle you do not track? He did not know. He had never bothered to look, assuming her life began and ended within the luxurious walls he provided. The humiliation of not knowing the most basic details of his own marriage burned in the back of his throat. He had treated her invisible labor as automatic, a fixture of the house as permanent as the marble floors. I need her location, Leonardo said, deliberately ignoring the questions he could not answer. He leaned forward, bracing his knuckles on the desk. And I need absolute discretion. Nobody in my organization can know you are looking for her. You work alone, you report only to me, and you leave no trace. Douglas slipped the photograph into his inner pocket, nodding once. Understood. When the discreet researcher finally left, the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving the syndicate leader entirely alone. The massive estate felt less like a castle and more like an empty vault. Douglas Miller did not waste time with dramatic introductions. The private investigator understood the architecture of power, which meant he knew better than to offer pity to a man who controlled a criminal empire. He sat in the heavy leather chair across from the mahogany desk and simply slid a plain manila folder forward. She is not in Chicago, Mr. Moretti, Douglas said, his voice entirely neutral. She never was. Leonardo Moretti stared at the closed folder. A strange cold weight settled in his chest. He had expected a hotel receipt or a temporary apartment lease in a quiet suburb. He reached out and flipped the cover open. It was a dense legal document, bound with the embossed seal of a prominent commercial real estate firm. The commercial lease, specifically, a 5-year contract for a retail storefront located in the historic North End of Boston. The zoning permits attached were approved for commercial food preparation. A bakery. He turned to the final page. There, resting on the dotted line, was her signature. It was not the sweeping Ava Moretti's signature she had used for 8 years on syndicate tax returns and charity foundation checks. The handwriting was smaller, tighter, and infinitely more deliberate. Ava Vance. Her maiden name. Leo traced the blue ink with his index finger. The paper felt unnaturally heavy. He turned his attention to the financial summary. She had not touched a single cent of his money. She had financed the entire lease, the security deposits, and the initial equipment using her own premarital savings. It was an account Leo had forgotten existed because the balance was too small to register on his financial radar. When was this signed? Leo asked. The words felt like dry ash. 6 weeks ago, Douglas answered quietly. 6 weeks ago, long before she had packed her modest suitcase. Leo looked past the investigator, staring at the rain blurring the floor-to-ceiling windows. 6 weeks ago, he had been entirely consumed by a multi-million-dollar shipping port negotiation. He had returned home late every night, finding his wife sitting quietly in the reading room, assuming her silence was a symptom of gentle deference. She had not been waiting for him. She had been quietly coordinating a cross-country relocation, securing municipal permits, and legally binding herself to a new city. She had built an entirely independent architecture for her life right across the dining table from him, and he had noticed absolutely nothing. Douglas stood up, smoothing the front of his suit. He left the room without another word, pulling the heavy door shut until it clicked. The silence in the office was absolute. Leo had spent his life managing thousands of men, assuming he possessed an unmatched awareness of his surroundings. Yet, the most profound escape had been executed flawlessly by the woman he had sworn to protect. Within the hour, Leo stood in the central corridor of the syndicate headquarters. His head of security approached with a tablet in hand. "We have the Boston address," the captain said. "I'll prep the convoy. We can have an advance team secure the perimeter of the bakery before you arrive." "No," Leo said. His voice was dangerously soft. "Cancel the detail. I am traveling alone." He did not want guards standing on the cobblestones. He did not want the violent machinery of his empire invading her space. He needed to see her exactly as she was. He convinced himself she had to be struggling. Boston winters were notoriously brutal, and the physical labor of running a food business was exhausting. He fully expected to arrive and find her shivering, overwhelmed by the harsh reality of independence. He drove himself back to the empty lakefront estate to prepare for the flight. He walked up the sweeping marble staircase and entered the master suite, moving toward the massive cedar walk-in closet to pack a bag. He pulled down a dark leather overnight duffel. He unzipped it, laying it flat on the central island. Then he stopped. For the first time in a decade, Leo Moretti did not know what to do next. He opened a drawer where his heavy cashmere sweaters were normally stacked in perfect rows. It was a chaotic mess of mixed fabrics. He had been pulling clothes out carelessly for 3 weeks, completely ignorant of the fact that the system had collapsed. He could not find his leather toiletry case. He did not know where his winter socks were kept. He stood in the center of the immaculate cedar room, entirely paralyzed. For 8 years, every time he needed to travel, a perfectly packed bag had simply materialized by the front door. Ava had anticipated the climate, the duration of the trip, and the social requirements of every meeting. She had managed the invisible logistics of his existence so flawlessly that he had mistaken her labor for magic. He grabbed a dark wool sweater and attempted to fold it. The sleeves twisted awkwardly. The fabric bunched up. It looked clumsy and ridiculous lying in the bottom of the expensive leather bag. He stared at the unevenly packed luggage, a sharp wave of humiliation washing over him. A man who commanded a terrifying empire could not locate his own gloves. The profound depth of his dependence on her invisible care was suddenly laid bare. He zipped the bag shut with a sharp, jagged motion. He simply carried the clumsy weight of his own incompetence out of the silent house, walking out into the freezing Chicago wind to begin the long journey east. Frost does not negotiate with the warmth of a city. It simply settles wherever it is allowed to rest. The cobblestone streets of Boston's North End were slick with morning ice, forcing Leonardo Moretti to walk slower than his usual commanding stride. The air was sharp, biting at the collar of his heavy cashmere coat. He was a man built for the expansive, fortified silence of a lakeside estate, not the narrow, winding alleys of a historic neighborhood waking up to the dawn. His leather shoes clicked unevenly against the ancient brick. In Chicago, armored SUVs and silent men preceded his every arrival. Doors were held open. Here, he was just a solitary figure navigating the commute, sidestepping hurried college students and men carrying newspapers. He stopped half a block away from the address on the commercial lease Douglas had provided. The building was old, possessing a brick facade weathered by decades of Atlantic wind. Warm, golden light spilled from the wide front windows, melting the frost on the pavement directly beneath it. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance. It did not carry his formidable surname. The syndicate leader closed the distance slowly. As he reached the entrance, the door swung open, releasing a cloud of steam and the sound of low, cheerful conversation into the freezing street. A woman in a thick wool scarf brushed past him, holding a paper bag close to her chest. She did not apologize or flinch at his imposing frame. She simply moved around him, entirely unimpressed. He raised his hand to the brass handle and stopped. His fingers hovered inches from the cold metal. This was not a boardroom waiting for his final verdict. It was not a clandestine warehouse where men stood at attention the moment his shadow crossed the threshold. It was a brightly lit, functioning sanctuary of ordinary life. The sheer normalcy of the place felt like a physical barrier. He exhaled, watching his breath turn to white mist in the freezing air. For a decade, he had believed his absolute control was a form of protection. He had built a fortress around his wife, assuming the high walls of their estate kept her safe. He had never considered that a fortress is indistinguishable from a cage until the door is locked from the outside. The brass handle felt heavier than the imported firearms locked in his Chicago safe. His jaw tightened. He adjusted the cuff of his coat, a microscopic delay, before finally wrapping his hand around the metal. He pushed the door open. A small brass bell mounted above the frame chimed. It was a bright, cheerful sound. He stepped inside. The immediate wave of heat was disorienting, carrying a scent so rich and domestic it struck him like a physical blow. The air smelled of roasted espresso, melting butter, caramelized cinnamon, and the soft, dusty sweetness of vanilla flour. It was an environment of profound creation. The man stood still, acutely aware of the lingering scent of cold rain and imported cigar smoke clinging to his coat. The absolute normalcy of the room stripped him of his armor. He was a predator, wandering into a greenhouse. He moved toward the back, keeping his head lowered, and claimed a small table in the far corner. The chair was simple wood, slightly uneven on the tile floor. He did not remove his coat. Behind the glass display counter, illuminated by hanging copper lamps, stood Ava Vance. He He stopped breathing. She was sliding a tray of golden, steam-rising pastries into the glass case. She wore a plain white cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, covered by a simple, flour-dusted linen apron. Her hair, usually sprayed and pinned into the rigid, flawless styles required for syndicate galas, was pulled back in a loose, messy knot. A faint streak of powdered sugar marked her left cheek. She looked entirely unbothered. She looked vibrant. She looked 10 years younger. "Clara, if you put the almond croissants next to the lemon tarts, they're going to fight for attention," Ava said. Her voice was clear and musical, carrying across the low hum of the morning crowd. The husband felt a sharp ache in the center of his chest. He had not heard that particular, unguarded tone in years. In the sprawling silence of their Chicago mansion, her voice had slowly become hushed, measured, and carefully neutral. She had learned to speak only in the spaces between his business calls. "Let them fight, darling," an older woman with silver hair replied, laughing as she arranged a vase of fresh tulips on the counter. Clara Higgins moved with the comfortable familiarity of a lifelong friend. "The neighborhood needs a little drama on a Tuesday morning." Ava laughed. The sound pinned the silent watcher to his uneven wooden chair. It was a genuine, full-bodied laugh, completely devoid of the polite restraint she used around his captains and his demanding family. He stared at her hands as she wiped down the gleaming espresso machine. The overhead light caught her bare fingers. The platinum band he had purchased to mark his territory was gone. Her hands were capable, fast, and entirely her own. For the first time in his life, he understood the total irrelevance of his empire. He had offered her credit cards, security details, and a name that made grown men tremble. She had traded it all for a linen apron, a flour-dusted counter, and the freedom to laugh with an elderly florist before dawn. His money had never kept her warm. It had only buried her. He sat in the corner, a stranger in a heavy coat, watching the woman he loved thrive in a world he did not own. The morning sun slanted across the wooden floorboards, catching tiny motes of flour suspended in the warm air. At the corner table, Leo remained perfectly still. His dark tailored wool coat stood out sharply against the pastel walls and the rustic, mismatched chairs of the bakery. For years, he had been accustomed to environments defined by shadowed corners, heavy oak tables, and the silent, fearful deference of the men in his syndicate. Here, surrounded by the bright chatter of morning commuters and the deep, comforting aroma of roasted espresso and baking yeast, his presence felt unnervingly out of place. He watched his wife from across the room, waiting for the inevitable moment when she would finally turn and notice him. He braced himself for the panic, the widened eyes, the sudden halting of her breath. He expected the fear that always accompanied a man of his reputation, appearing unannounced. Instead, when Ava finally looked up from the glass display case and met his gaze, nothing in her expression shattered. The small brass bell above the door chimed as another customer left, leaving a brief, fragile silence in its wake. Ava did not freeze. She did not drop the silver pastry tongs. She simply finished wiping down the marble countertop with measured, deliberate strokes, folding the white cloth neatly beside the register. Her posture remained entirely relaxed, her shoulders loose beneath the pale linen apron that had replaced the heavy, restrictive designer fabric she used to wear in Chicago. Leo felt a sudden, strange tightness in his chest. Her calm was more terrifying than any scream. He watched as she turned to the espresso machine, picking up a heavy ceramic mug. She poured black coffee into it, the dark liquid steaming in the cool morning light. She moved with an easy, fluid grace that he had never seen in their cavernous lakefront estate. Every step she took toward his table was steady. There was no hesitation, no frantic looking around for an escape route. When she reached him, she placed the mug down on the center of the small wooden table. The ceramic base met the wood without a single rattle. Her hands were completely steady. He stared at her fingers, noticing the faint dusting of white flour on her knuckles and the absence of the platinum band that used to anchor her to his world. She looked directly into his eyes, offering a polite, professional smile that contained no warmth, no history, and no surrender. It was the exact expression of a gracious host serving a patron. Leo stared at the dark surface of the coffee, struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the quiet, invisible presence he had left behind weeks ago. He leaned forward, instinct automatically driving him to assert control. in the boardrooms and dimly lit warehouses of his daily life, a lowered voice and a steady stare were enough to bend any opposition. He kept his tone flat, a quiet, dangerous whisper designed to ensure none of the elderly patrons or laughing students at the neighboring tables would overhear. He told her to go to the back room, take off the apron, and pack whatever she needed. He informed her that a car was waiting outside to take them to the airport and that they were returning to Chicago immediately. He expected the familiar compliance, the silent lowering of her eyes, or perhaps a defensive argument that he could easily dismantle. Instead, Ava merely adjusted the small notepad tucked into the pocket of her apron. She did not step back, nor did she lean in to match his intensity. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was light and perfectly conversational, pitched at the exact volume one might use to discuss the morning weather. She told him that she could not possibly leave. She explained, with genuine, polite regret, that she had a fresh batch of sourdough proofing in the back, a morning rush to manage, and a legally binding commercial lease to honor. The absolute absurdity of his own demands was suddenly glaring. Ava looked at him not as a dangerous man who held her fate, but as an inconvenience disrupting her workflow. She gestured gently to the steaming mug. She told him to enjoy the coffee, adding that it was on the house for a first-time visitor. Without waiting for his response, without asking for his permission, she turned her back on him to greet a new customer. Leo remained frozen in the small wooden chair, his hands resting uselessly on his knees. He looked down at the dark, untouched liquid, realizing with crushing clarity that his power could force many things, but it could not force her to belong to him anymore. Before Leonardo Moretti could formulate another demand to her turned back, the brass bell above the heavy door chimed sharply. A sudden rush of morning commuters spilled into the shop, bringing a gust of cold harbor air and the cheerful noise of a neighborhood waking up. Ava seamlessly slipped into the rhythm of her new world, stepping to the register alongside Clara. The syndicate boss remained immobilized, sidelined by the sheer normalcy of the morning rush. His large hands rested flat against his thighs. He was forced to sit quietly, an unwelcome spectator in a life he had completely failed to anticipate. The air around him was thick with the comforting scent of roasted espresso beans and melting butter, a stark contrast to the sterile, cigar-stained air of his boardrooms. He watched as Ava moved gracefully behind the espresso machine. Clara Higgins, the elderly florist who ran the shop next door, stood comfortably near the pastry case. Clara chatted brightly as she helped hand out paper napkins, treating the baker not as the fragile, ornamental wife of a Chicago boss, but as an equal, a trusted pillar of their small community. The younger woman did not look stressed by the long line. She looked perfectly in control, her shoulders unburdened by the heavy expectations of his world. In Chicago, men stood at attention when the boss entered a room. They stopped speaking the moment he raised a hand. Here, in this sunlit space, he was completely invisible. He watched the woman who had flawlessly managed the sprawling logistics of his lakefront estate now apply that same terrifying competence to a line of hungry locals. She remembered their regular orders without asking. She laughed, a bright, unguarded, melodic sound that made his chest physically ache. A young boy in a bright yellow raincoat approached the counter. He clutched a crumpled piece of construction paper. Ava leaned over the glass pastry case, her expression softening entirely. The boy proudly handed her the paper, a crude crayon drawing of the bakery, complete with a bright sun. She accepted the drawing as if she had just been handed a priceless artifact. She carefully pinned it to a corkboard behind the register, right next to the framed commercial lease. Leonardo watched her brush the boy's shoulder with gentle affection. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent his entire life building an empire of fear, transactional loyalty, and enforced respect. But what he saw in front of him was freely given devotion. These people did not fear his wife. They loved her. And she had built this warm, unshakable sanctuary entirely without his money, his influence, or his permission. When the morning rush began to thin, Leo stood up. He did not approach the counter again. His throat felt tight. He left a crisp $100 bill beside his cooling, untouched ceramic cup, an old reflex that immediately felt cheap and inadequate. The brass bell chimed as he pushed through the door, stepping out into the crisp chill of the historic North End. He walked away from the warm glow of the bakery's front windows turning his heavy collar up against the coastal wind. He did not pull out his phone to call his armed driver. He did not order a retreat to the private jet. Instead, he navigated the narrow cobblestone streets on foot until he found a modest, historic hotel a few blocks away. The lobby lacked the sweeping marble staircases he usually demanded, offering only quiet oak paneling. Upstairs, in a standard room that felt smaller than his master closet in Chicago, the syndicate leader sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. The springs creaked beneath his weight. There was no panoramic view of a skyline, only a single window looking out over a damp brick alleyway. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was flooded with encrypted messages from his captains, men waiting for directives on shipping routes and territorial disputes. His empire was frantically demanding its king. He dialed his second-in-command. The line connected instantly, the voice on the other end tense and expectant, waiting for orders. "Listen to me carefully," Leo said. His voice was stripped of its usual commanding roar, reduced to a quiet, absolute warning. "No one comes to Boston. No shipments, no scouts, no personnel. This city is entirely off limits. If I find out a single man from our organization has crossed the city limits, I will consider it a direct act of treason." He ended the call before the captain could reply, dropping the phone onto the nightstand. The device landed with a dull thud. He sat alone in the dim light of the room. Outside the window, the mundane sounds of the city continued, the distant rattle of a delivery truck, the low hum of traffic, the faint chatter of pedestrians. It was an entire world turning smoothly without him. He stared at his empty hands. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his vast Chicago empire provided an unbreakable fortress around his marriage. He had confused control with connection, assuming her quiet compliance meant she was satisfied with the cage he had built. Now, sitting in an unfamiliar room miles away from his territory, the truth was brutally undeniable. His power was absolutely useless here. He could order a rival destroyed with a single phone call. But he could not command his wife to look at him the way she had looked at a child with a crayon drawing. The quiet void in his chest expanded, leaving him with the terrifying understanding that his money had bought him everything except the one thing he actually wanted. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale silver frost. Leonardo Moretti left behind his heavy, custom-tailored Chicago overcoat for a simple, unbranded wool jacket. He walked down the cobblestone streets of the North End, letting the harsh chill ground him in the reality of the city Ava Vance had chosen. The air carried the sweet scent of roasted espresso. Leo stopped at the edge of the street, looking at the bright storefront of the bakery. A line had already formed, spilling onto the frost-covered sidewalk. In Chicago, his presence alone would have caused a crowd to part. But here, stripped of his syndicate name, he was entirely anonymous. He walked slowly toward the bakery. He did not march to the front or tap on the glass. Instead, he stepped to the back of the line, joining the neighborhood locals. He stood in the freezing air, and he simply waited. The physical act of waiting was a silent humiliation, but it was the first honest action he had taken in years. An elderly woman, moving carefully with an aluminum walker, approached the edge of the line. She looked hesitantly at the queue, shivering in her thin coat. Without a second thought, the powerful man took a step back, gesturing gracefully for her to take the space ahead of him. "Thank you, young man," she murmured. "You have a good heart." "Take your time," Leo replied quietly, lacking his usual authority. As she settled in, he realized exactly what this meant. He was no longer an untouchable executive whose time was infinitely valuable. He was just an ordinary patron, hoping for a few minutes of his wife's attention. He could clearly see Ava organizing the pastry display, her hands deft and capable. She was not a possession waiting in a silent mansion. She was the center of a community that actually saw her. The line moved forward, step by honest step. His endless money meant nothing here. He had to earn his way inside. The small brass bell jingled as he finally stepped over the threshold. The temperature inside was immediately comforting, heavy with the scent of rising dough. The cheerful hum of conversation was a stark contrast to the echoing silence of his cavernous estate. He moved to the wooden counter. His wife was standing by the register, wiping her hands on a simple linen apron. A faint dusting of white flour highlighted the absence of the heavy platinum band she used to wear. She did not flinch when he stepped up. Her posture remained impeccably composed, anchored by the certainty of her own independence. "What can I get for you?" she asked. Her tone was polite, professional, and entirely devoid of the silent resentment that had defined their last years together. "I don't expect you to pack," Leo said quietly, his voice pitched low over the hiss of the espresso machine. He kept his hands respectfully at his sides. "I don't expect you to come back to Chicago. I understand now." Ava held his gaze, allowing the heavy silence to stretch between them. "I spent years thinking I was protecting you by giving you an empire," Leo continued, the words heavy with belated regret. "I was just burying you inside it. I treated your invisible labor as a default, while I gave all my attention to a world that would gladly replace me tomorrow. You carried the weight of my life, and I never even looked down to see that your hands were bleeding." He took a slow, measured breath, the scent of vanilla grounding him. "I am not asking you to give this up," he said, gesturing slightly to the bustling shop. "I am not asking for forgiveness today. I just want to know if I can buy a cup of black coffee and a simple pastry and sit at that small table in the corner. Just to watch you work. Just to learn who you are when you aren't forced to carry my shadow." Ava looked at him in the quiet space between customers. The arrogant, schedule-obsessed boss she had married was gone, replaced by a man willing to accept the absolute loss of his control. She turned to the espresso machine without a word. A moment later, she placed a dark coffee and a warm almond croissant on the counter. "That will be $4.50, she said softly. Leo handed her a crisp $5 bill. He didn't offer a corporate card or tell her to keep the change, participating in the modest transaction exactly as she required. Ava opened the till. As she handed him his 2 silver quarters, her fingers briefly brushed against his open palm. The touch was fleeting, but it carried the unmistakable warmth of a living connection. It was not the obligatory touch of a dutiful wife submitting to a provider, but the cautious, voluntary contact of an equal. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a promise of immediate reconciliation. It was simply permission to exist in her space, on her terms, while he attempted to prove he had changed. He took his cup and turned away, taking a seat at the small table in the corner. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug, looking out at the bright Boston street, then back to the dignified woman commanding the room. Love is rarely lost in one terrible moment. It slowly disappears through ordinary choices, and it is rebuilt, if it is ever rebuilt at all, through the quiet, ordinary decision to show up, wait your turn, and finally see the person standing right in front of you.